Creationism is not appropriate for children. That's the title of a video that has gone viral by Bill Nye, the science guy. It's actually put out by Big Think rather than Bill Nye himself, but obviously Bill Nye narrated it and approved of it, and it has now gone viral to the tune of 4,800,000 votes views, and it's still counting. Some who view it oppose it, and some agree with it. The votes for like and dislike are about 80% positive. They also present a very small sample of the people who actually viewed it. So you can take that for what it's worth. I think that it's fair to say that Bill Nye has hit a nerve. It is tempting to say that he shouldn't have made the video, and then we wouldn't have to deal with the questions underlying it, but I think if he hadn't, somebody else would have. And although it may not have gone quite as viral, the point is still that there are issues that need to be dealt with. Now, at this point, I'm going to exit the slides and show you the video itself, if I can. Wait a minute. We need to be over here where we can get to the microphone as well. So let me just move this.
Denial of evolution is unique to the United States. I mean, we are the world's most advanced technological, so I mean, you could say Japan, but generally the United States is where most of the innovation still happens. People still move to the United States. And that's largely because of the intellectual capital we have, the general understanding of science. When you have a portion of the population that doesn't believe in it, it holds everybody back, really. Evolution is the fundamental idea in all of life science, in all of biology. It's very much analogous to trying to do geology without believing in tectonic plates. You're just not going to get the right answer. Your whole world is just going to be a mystery instead of an exciting place. As my old professor Carl Sagan said, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. So once in a while I get people that really, that claim they don't believe in evolution. And my response generally is, so why not? Really, why not? Your world just becomes fantastically complicated when you don't believe in evolution. I mean, here are these ancient dinosaur bones or fossils. Here is radioactivity. Here are distant stars that are just like our star, but that are at a different point in their life cycle. The idea of deep time, of this billions of years, explains so much of the world around us. If you try to ignore that, your worldview just becomes crazy. It's just untenable, self-inconsistent. And I say to the grown-ups, if you want to deny evolution and live in your world that's completely inconsistent with everything we observe in the universe, that's fine. But don't make your kids do it, because we need them. We need scientifically literate voters and taxpayers for the future. We need people that can, we need engineers that can build stuff, solve problems. It's just really a hard thing. It's really a hard thing. You know, in another couple centuries, that worldview, I'm sure, will be, it just won't exist. I mean, there's no evidence for it. So.
Well, my analysis of that. I think that it helps the video to go viral that he slightly overstated his case. In further interviews about the video and his kind of amazement that it's gone viral, by the way, it sat around on the internet for quite some time before it finally exploded. He has acknowledged that he's really talking about public school education. He's not going to go into your homes and make sure that you don't teach your kids about creation. It is more exciting to think that he would prohibit parents from teaching their children creationism. You know, that makes for a nice intrusive state, but that's not really what he's talking about. He's talking about the public school. It helps, of course, that he's a TV personality, and I think it helps that many agree with his message. The ratio of likes to dislikes, as I said, is running about 80%. It's a small sample, but even at that, it's substantial enough that that's probably where it's going viral. He starts out by saying denial of evolution is unique to the United States. Well, it's not quite true. But certainly it's much more widespread in the U.S. than in any other Western country. The only country that comes close to us in the developed world is Turkey. Turkey may even be ahead of us slightly in that regard. I think this fact is really important, but I think that Bill Nye misses its significance. And we'll come back to that. The United States is where most of the innovations still happen. People still move to the United States, and that's largely because of the intellectual capital we have. Well, I think that's partly true. It's also true that our freedom is important. People move here because they can think what they want to, and they can think what they actually believe without having the government come down on them. And I think that that's as important as the intellectual capital. And there's a certain amount of economic freedom that attracts people. And when you have a portion of the population that doesn't believe that referring to the general understanding of science, it holds everybody back, really. Really? Why not just ignore them and move on? I mean, you could say you're not getting the boost that you want from them, but it seems to me that one could at least leave them behind and keep on going. I think that's a demand that everybody back the system that he wants somewhat unfairly. Evolution is the fundamental idea in all of life science, in all of biology. Well, we'll have to disagree with that, and I'll come back to that idea. But it is, I think, nice to know where he's coming from, and I will say that it's a very common position. Don't forget Dobzhansky's famous quote that's been used many times because there are a lot of people who believe it. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's very much analogous to trying to do geology without believing in tectonic plates. You're just not going to get the right answer. I'm omitting the stuff where he's starting a sentence and stopping in the middle and coming back to it. Geology, in fact, was once done without tectonic plates. I guess we didn't get the right answer then. Interestingly, continental drift, which of course is the precursor of tectonic plates, was a creationist theory. And those of you who attended John Baumgartner's lectures know that it's still a creationist theory. In fact, geology was also once done without catastrophism. And guess who was responsible for that? It wasn't the creationists. As my old professor Carl Sagan said, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. I take it from that the distinguishing feature between the position Bill Nye is taking and creationism is evidently not that creationists are emotional. You're in love, you want to tell the world, so your world just becomes fantastically complicated when you don't believe in evolution. Well, as Einstein once said, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. And I think the important point there is you can make it so simple, but if you try to make it simpler than that, you start having to discard data, and at that point, you're making it too simple. And perhaps the universe simply is complicated, and we have to deal with that. I guess from that comment, at least you could say that the creationist approach is not simplistic. Here are these ancient dinosaur bones, or fossils. Well, here are the Schweitzer data, which are difficult to explain, assuming long ages. You remember Mary Schweitzer and finding what looked like blood vessels and red blood cells and elastic tissue that still maintained its elasticity, and now we're finding out that there are peptides that have survived, and how that happened over 100 million years is not clear. It's a little bit easier to understand if it perhaps was more like 6,000 or 10,000 years. Here is radioactivity. Well, here's carbon-14 in Pennsylvania coal and throughout the Phanerozoic, which again is difficult to explain on a long-age basis and is quite a bit easier to explain if the coal really isn't that old. And in fact, there's evidence of accelerated decay in isotope measurements and evidence of accelerated decay in nature. The experiments that were started qualitatively by Robert Gentry and then picked up by the Institute for Creation Research, and him as granodiorite in New Mexico are a good example. I wish we had more of them, but certainly that example is pretty straightforward to interpret on the basis of short age and much more difficult to interpret on the basis of long age. Now, to be fair, I don't think that Bill Nye can be expected to know about these data. They are, after all, put out in creationist journals, and very little attention is paid to them in the regular media, and so it's not clear how he would run into them. I'm hoping that someday he will, but who knows. Here are different stars that are just like our star, but they're at a different point in their life cycle. And I think this is probably the best argument he raises. It is possible that either Russell Humphreys or Barry Sutterfield is right. On the other hand, it is possible that the universe is old, but that the Earth, or at least life on Earth, is young. But those are, in the case of Russell Humphreys, his theory does not have any different predictions from the one that says the universe is old. So, and unfortunately, I haven't seen Barry Sutterfield put out predictions that could distinguish his theory from the standard. So I think that this is one point that I would have to give him. It does look like the universe is in fact old. The idea of deep time, of this billions of years, explains so much of the world around us. If you ignore that, your worldview just becomes crazy, just untenable. It's self-inconsistent, which is, I think, the right way to translate what he said, rather than itself inconsistent, as you may have seen on the screen. It does become inconsistent with the standard interpretation of geology. And I think that cosmology does present problems, and I would, at this point, I would say that the billions of years probably does belong in cosmology, or at least a good share of it. And I say to the grown-ups, if you want to deny evolution and live in your world that's completely inconsistent with everything that's we observe in the universe, that's fine, but don't make your kids do it because we needed them. This is, of course, the controversial part of the video, and probably the one that aroused the most intense liking and probably also the most intense disliking. Of course, if you're a grown-up and you believe that evolution in the standard sense didn't happen, then you're not likely to listen to what he has to say. Need them for what? We'll see. But I think that that doesn't mean I'm giving ulterior motives to him. I just want to make another point first. I personally wouldn't make my kids deny evolution, but I'd like to offer them the choice and the evidence that I know about. He goes on to say, this is why we need it. We need scientifically literate voters and taxpayers for the future. And we need engineers that can build stuff, solve problems. Why does an engineer need to believe in evolution? How you build a bridge does not depend on whether apes became humans. I know that a physician doesn't need to believe in evolution. That much I can tell you for sure because I am one and I don't. In fact, a physician that does very well in basic science doesn't have to believe in evolution. You know, in another couple of centuries, that worldview, I'm sure, just won't exist. There's no evidence for it. Well, we will see, but I don't think so. But perhaps it would be helpful for Bill Nye and those like him. This is not primarily aimed at Bill Nye personally, because he's speaking for a lot of people. To get acquainted with some of the more informed creationists, they might change their minds somewhat on this. Now, I think some overall observations besides the specific comments on what he had to say are in order. The United States, as he noted, is where most of the innovation happens. Still, the United States is the most strongly disbelieving nation regarding evolution. Doesn't that suggest, at a bare minimum, that belief in evolution does not fatally hamper technological advancement? In fact, if you push it, it might suggest that possibly there's a positive relationship between disbelief in evolution and technological innovation. I'm not sure I want to go strongly that far, but certainly it doesn't seem to be a drawback.
You've got a typo. I think you mean disbelief in evolution. Your third point?
Yes, there might be a positive relationship between disbelief in evolution and technological innovation. In other words, people who don't believe in evolution might be maybe a little better. Certainly societies that contain large numbers of people who don't believe in evolution seem to be doing better. And there might be even a causal relationship. There certainly is not a causal relationship, a strong causal relationship the other way. The idea that we need to believe in evolution to be good engineers, I think, is difficult to defend. I do think we need to believe in evolution to be good secular humanists, and I think that may be what he's looking at, really, without realizing it, or perhaps realizing it. Perhaps that's really what Bill Nye wants. He wants us all to be good secular humanists, and in order to do that, we have to believe in evolution. He is, after all, a prominent secular humanist himself. I believe he got an award for that last year or so. Evolution is not the most fundamental idea in biology, as he said. The idea that life only comes from life is even more fundamental. Think about it. If you get to the Cambrian explosion and all of a sudden here are these animals apparently without ancestors, wouldn't the easiest thing to be to just assume that they spontaneously generated, unless you know that spontaneous generation doesn't happen? And finally, Bill Nye, and again, this is not to be critical of him personally, he's speaking for a large number of people, is not an empiricist here, but rather a trusting believer in what the scientific authorities have said. Why do I say that? Bill Nye's background is that of an engineer. You may have wondered why he picked engineers out of the blue. I think that has something to do with it. He doesn't really know evolutionary biology intimately. He doesn't really know radiometric dating intimately. He is trusting what other people have told him. Now, there are people who, in general, when they talk about things in the present, have been trustworthy, and so I can understand why he would do that. But the fact of the matter is, this is not empirical science for him personally. This is belief in what he thinks the scientific community says. I say this as somebody who has participated in experimental research on the subject of deep time, specifically in carbon-14 dating. I think more empirical research would be a good idea here, and if he's willing to do some research, I'd certainly welcome it. I personally am glad that Bill Nye spoke in the video and that the Big Think made it. I think we're better served when people say with clarity what they really mean. And I hope that it's possible that a healthy dialogue, at least in some areas, can ensue. And maybe if we're lucky, we have a little bit of one here, although it's likely to be slanted to one side. Thank you, Bill. And with that, I will leave it for your questions and comments.
As one who reads fairly broadly, I am inundated with evolutionary theory. It's in everything that you read. You do not get the same amount of creationist theory in things that you read. You become an evolutionist almost by osmosis. It just pours in from every area. You have to be continually on your guard to resist that and not become almost unknowingly sympathetic to the evolutionary theory. I wish creationists could somehow be in print or in video more than they are.
I couldn't agree more.
It seems to me we can learn something from history, although, you know, we state at times the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But in this whole perspective, I think it's helpful to realize how humanity's basic ideas change and have changed over the centuries. You know, back in antiquity and so on, mind was the dominant thing over matter, and reason was very important, and so on. And that was the dominant idea. In the Middle Ages, we're more in an authoritarian mode and admiration of authority, including Aristotle, was somewhat dominant and so on, and this rhetoric was important, grammar was important, and so on. And that was the mood at that time. And then in the last 2 centuries, we've seen a change to materialism. And instead of mind being so important, matter is important, and we're in a materialistic mode. And to me, the important thing of this is that as society has moved into a materialist mode, and of course science leads the way in this, at least certain interpretations of science lead in that way. As you move in that direction, you need to realize that science has been redefined. Using the term science in the broad definition of the study of nature. Because, you know, a few centuries ago, the leading scientists who established science, or at least established modern science, I should state, they believed in God, believed in creation, and very much so, many of them, majority believed in the Bible, the story of creation and so on. I'm speaking of people like Galileo and Pascal and Kepler and Newton and Linné, for instance, as a biologist and so on. The basic laws and principles of a modern science were actually established by people who had a much broader outlook than the narrow outlook that we now have in science. And to me, this is intellectually restrictive and no way to find truth. Science has moved from the broad aspect it had, and they were called philosophers, then natural philosophers and so on, but they were studying nature like science does now. But they had a broader outlook, and science has restricted itself and put itself in this box of naturalism, if you want to call it. You can call it materialism or mechanism, all terms that are basically we call it, you know, various things to try and not use the term atheism, which has a certain negative connotation to it, but essentially modern science is atheistic. And practically it's that way and so on. This to me is no way to find truth. If you want to find truth, you need to have as open a mind you have, possibilities and so on. Furthermore, to go this route to me is too simplistic. I cannot explain freedom of choice in a purely cause and effect mechanistic system of thinking. And if we have no freedom of choice, we're not responsible for our behavior and so on. Our whole justice system falls apart if we don't make people responsible for their behavior. Society is not going that way per se, as some scientists might suggest. Our sense of right and wrong, and I think everybody, I think even Nye would have that idea, you know, there are things that are right and wrong and so on. It seems to be above the mechanistic level. And so on, where love would be above that level and so on, so that I'm unsatisfied with a mechanistic approach. I'm unsatisfied with a philosophy that excludes some of these important things, and I don't think that this is a good way to find truth. And we need to be as open as we can. And when you're open as you can, You find a lot of scientific data that demands a designer, that demands a God, intelligent design and so on. We don't know where that God comes from and so on, but we know he exists. And that much of our data is explained better that way than otherwise. And then, of course, when it comes to the Bible, you've got data that you can at least a fair amount of stuff in nature supports it. The geological data, contrary to what he might suggest. There's some interesting questions out there for those who don't believe in the biblical account of beginnings. So, to me, we shouldn't go the simplistic way now. But let's be more open. He talks about it's complicated and so on. Reality is always more complex than our simple minds make it. At least I shouldn't say always, but almost always, and so on. So that's the way I think we should go if we want to find truth.
There are 2 points that I find troubling about this video that was posted. One point is something that strikes me about the way science is presented with respect to this particular question. There is no other question that anyone in science would ever advocate this kind of stand. And when I say this, I mean, I recall to mind when I was in graduate school, and I recall overhearing some of the professors who had just finished giving an exam to a bunch of students, and then they were talking to one another about the exam questions, whether the questions were fair and so on. And what struck me was what one of them said to the other. Oh, we always keep the same questions. We just change which answers are the correct ones from year to year. So what used to be correct several years ago is now no longer correct. Now some other answer will be the more correct one. In view of that, it never occurred to me that anybody would ever advocate, don't teach your children this or that view of this or that in science. How could anybody ever do that? Right? So why is it that evolution, evolutionary thinking, is somehow singled out of all the many controversial topics in science as the one thing that you must not challenge your children to question? Why is it that all the other major topics of interest, whether grand or small, are legitimate to challenge and question to your heart's delight, but this is one topic you must not challenge? What is so sacred about it? And if it is sacred, how is it we think of it as science?
Well, I think that there is actually one more subject that gets the same kind of treatment, and that's global warming. What the two of them have in common make an interesting discussion. Comment here. And I think there's another one back there as soon as you're done.
I wish that it were possible to carry on a discussion supporting creationism in a way that didn't, to put it bluntly, in a way that didn't suggest that all scientists are in cahoots and are faking data. As you pointed out, there are many scientists out there that don't even think of evolution when they're building bridges, and as physicians we rarely, if ever, have an occasion to deal with it directly. But because of the the way in which creationism has been supported, and I think much of that is unnecessary and inappropriate, we've ended up inferring in Adventist circles that science generally can't be trusted, or scientists that are evolutionists can't be trusted because their evolutionary ideas are going to permeate everything else that they do. And the reason that I'm thinking of this at the moment is that 2 weeks ago I was with a group of doctors and nurses traveling. And I was asked a question which, as my wife will testify, so stunned me that I couldn't actually function for a couple of hours thereafter. One of the nurses on the trip, I was talking about aging and the research that I was doing into the causes of aging. And in all innocence, she asked me, how often do I do, and she was talking about statistics, an analysis and have the result come out as a big surprise in directions that I hadn't anticipated. When I said, well, most of the time, probably 80% of the time, what I think is going to happen when I do the analysis doesn't. And she said, she was in disbelief. She apparently views science and scientists, and she's a nurse, as knowing exactly what they're going to find and then going out there and doing the necessary experiments and finding it. And as you know, I was discussing research that was ongoing, and I answered her truthfully. About maybe 20% of the time when I set up an experiment and do a calculation, it does in fact confirm what I had thought was the case. About 80%, way more than half of the time, I'm totally surprised and have to go back and rethink the approach that I was taking. That's not apparently the impression that we have successfully conveyed to Adventist church members generally. I think what we've successfully conveyed to them is that most scientists know what the answer is. They go out there and they find it. And this has permeated not just in evolution and creation field. It's permeated to pretty much everything we do. And so now we've raised a generation within the Adventist church who think that science and scientists are all on the take, and we're all in cahoots with each other, and particularly evolutionary scientists are going to come up with what they're going to come up with, regardless of what the data shows, because they're evolutionists and they don't want to come up with anything that would in any way threaten it. And I think that's unfortunate. But after three hours or so, I recovered and was able to go back and give another lecture on aging. It had nothing to do with evolution. Evolution hadn't even been mentioned. But this person and several other people there looked at this data and said, well, obviously Brian knows what he's going to find, and he's just sort of setting up an experiment, and the data will support him, and then he reports it. That's not the way that I've experienced my life of doing research.
Let's take it a turn here. Go ahead. Well, I might respond to it too. I think there is a sense in which that kind of thing does happen, in that what I'm told in graduate school by people who are there is that what you do is you do the experiments to find out what you're going to get your next grant on. And then you get the grant, and then you use part of that grant money to do the experiments to do the next one. And so there is a sense in which when you repeat
that's certainly
the experiment,
true. You're one experiment ahead, but that's
you're one
not
experiment ahead. But your experiment that you are ahead, it'd be interesting to know what percentages that most of your colleagues would say on that. I suspect that there are some who would say, oh, I'm surprised 15% of the time, and I think there are others who would agree with you that 80% is a better estimate.
Well, I've done a lot of research with people in other countries, and my odds are the same as all the people. I've never found a person in my entire life that I've done research with who, in my opinion, many of them were evolutionists, who, in my opinion, let that affect the way in which they approached their science.
Yeah.
I mean, they knew I was a creationist and I didn't believe in evolution. I knew they were evolutionists. It had nothing to do with the way in which they did their science and the way in which they interpreted it. And never once did we ever come to a situation in which I thought they were shading the data because of their philosophical beliefs. And yet we've communicated that as a result of these kinds of discussions fairly effectively to many of the people in the church. And I think it's unfortunate. I don't know how to back away from it, but I've never seen a scientist shade his conclusions on the basis of his philosophical considerations. Now,
well,
I won't say it never happens.
Now, here's the thing. What do you do with the Schweitzer data, for example? I'm sure that Mary Schweitzer was totally stunned. This was one of the 80% that she did not expect to find in Tyrannosaurus stuff.
Sure.
For, I think, what are obvious reasons that have to do with evolution.
Yeah, she would be surprised. But I must say,
she was surprised if you...
parenthetically, those aren't red blood cells, and she never claimed that they were.
No.
All she said was that they were globules.
They looked like them.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are people who resist the results of the experiment on the basis of their belief system as to how long ago these things lived and how long these kind of things can last.
I personally have never met a scientist who did that, but I assume that there must be.
Oh, there are people who are published in the literature who say this is the reason why we're having trouble buying your conclusions, is because they lived a long time ago and structures like that simply can't survive. And so these must be some kind of artifact that, maybe they're made by bacteria. But there's got to be some other explanation than that they're relics that are left over, because relics just simply can't be left over that long. And they're very explicit as to their reasoning behind that. So, yeah, I think it does color how you look at things, colors how you're going to interpret data, even if it doesn't color the data itself. And I do have to say that she did publish it. It was controversial, but it got into the literature, so therefore I think it's. But I don't think it's. I think it's fair to say that we often run into surprises. I think it's fair to say that sometimes the surprises don't get published because they're not considered important enough. And there's a small filtering effect. How big that filtering effect is, I don't know. I do know that some observations that I made that are kind of interesting never made it into the literature because, I mean, how do you publish that kind of stuff? You can't make an article out of a single set of data, for example, that the difference between amyotrophic lateral sclerosis in vegetarians and non-vegetarians is virtually identical in terms of at least the death certificates. That's all you've got. That's not enough for an article. So it never got into the literature, even though I found it. So there is some filtering that goes on. But I agree with you that I think we're in a dangerous spot when we start saying that these people didn't see what they saw because they were so prejudiced that they're making up data to support it. I think that obviously happens in rare cases, but I think they are very rare, and the reason that they're rare is because of the structure of science, which says anything you do has to be reproducible. And so most people, with the exception of people like John Darcy, but they're rare, try very hard to make sure that what they do is reproducible, because otherwise they're going to eat it later on.
That's not pleasant.
Yeah.
Two things.
We'll come back to you in just a minute.
Addressing that issue, I think that unfortunately, because evolution really involves to a large degree the biological sciences and cosmetology. But since all the science, whether it be physics, mathematics, etc., is science, they tend to, that particular group that uses evolution in their working life, it doesn't matter a lot to a mathematician, I don't think, what the origin is. And so if you take science as a whole and all the people out there doing science, it should be a very small minority. But I think, to go back to your question, the reason that this is so important, I was just reading this morning, and it struck me in that tape. I'm going to read a quote here. "It will be urged that a few who stand in opposition to the institutions of the church and the law of the state ought not to be tolerated, and it is better for them to suffer than for a whole nation to be thrown into confusion and lawlessness." Combined with the first angel's message, which was preached in church, and it's always God's signature is always who created the heavens and the earth and the sea. It always comes down, whether it be in the fourth commandment or throughout Revelation. That one stamp of his authority, his creatorship, is a defining position for why he should be worshipped over and over again in Scripture. And I believe that is why this is a battleground, because evolution is a direct assault on God's position and his stamp of authority and why he should be worshipped. Not to diminish the fact that he should be worshipped for his love and his grace, etc. But if you read Revelation, it's pretty clear that that's always tied in there. And I think that's why this is such an intense battleground, and why these few people feel so intensely about the fact that we must not teach our children this, is that there's a much larger issue. And if you got creationism, you got Christianity, and you got the worship of a creator God, game's up.
Well, I don't think that Bill Nye is thinking in those kinds of terms.
I'll grant you that. I didn't think that he was the only one trying to manipulate the way things are here on Earth.
I think that Bill Nye is looking at it from the point of view of secular humanism is correct. These people, they just won't listen to we have control of the college education, the academy education, or high school education, elementary education, we're moving down there. But it's just somehow not enough. And to hear these people trying to carve out a place for themselves. And, you know, we're right, but we're not winning, so therefore we need to work a little harder at it. That's what it boils down to. And I think that that's really more of what he's looking at. It bothers him that the U.S. is the nation with the largest number of evolution doubters.
But it also bothers me that we always are on the defensive with, yes, we have an issue with the stars and billions of years, depending on how you view that, whether Earth was created later and so forth. And yes, there are issues. But if we chose to take the offensive, could point out a number of issues in the reverse that are screaming for explanation also. And I don't think we need to call on them in terms of an attack, but we should have the right, as they ask us to justify our position in light of this data, that we ask them to justify their position in light of other data. And that reverse discussion is not allowed to be verbalized enough that I've seen in order to have the discussion occur. It's amazing. We want to squelch the discussion. Had this discussion on a flight recently with someone sitting next to me, and he took the exact position. Well, why would I want my children to be able to hear about this? And my question is, why wouldn't you want your children to be able to think for themselves and hear multiple sides of any issue and develop the critical thinking skills to think? Why would you want them to have somebody else tell you what they should think? And he said, well, they trust science. Science must be, somehow this God of science wouldn't make a mistake. Little do they know how much we keep growing and learning.
We've come in here and then one here and then over there. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Just a couple of comments. As Ariel pointed out, really, the foundation of science, a lot of the founding forefathers were theists or creationists. And we talked a little bit about Newton, Kepler, Maxwell. So I think Bill Nye really has some challenges historically, making the statement that theism or creationism holds science back, because we have some historical data that kind of proves the opposite, and especially if we start talking about Newton. And to kind of paraphrase C.S. Lewis, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. They expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So
not only in a God, but a particular kind of God who is orderly.
That's right. And speaking of orderly, why should we even trust our own scientific process or our senses if it's just the byproduct of some random unguided process? If your laptop was made by some random unguided process, you probably wouldn't use it. But you expect it to be organized. You expect there to be law behind that. In fact, when Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, "Oh, great, I know how it works. I don't need God." In fact, he praised God when he wrote the Principia Mathematica in that. So, because he figures out how it works, doesn't alleviate God. I think oftentimes the creationist perspective or the theist perspective is distorted, in that we hold to a God of the gaps argument. Well, God did it, and that's it. That's the end of it. And I find just the opposite. I think because there's design, because God did it, finding out how is all that more interesting than just saying, well, it was an accident. A second thing, too, I'd like to mention, we talked about kind of the dogmatic approach to evolution, is I kind of feel bad for the atheists, especially in some regard, because evolution really is the only game in town. It has to be true. Whereas as theists, or even as creationists, we're kind of open to all the data. We're open to follow where it leads. That may, is it old earth creation, new earth creation, but we're still open as theists nonetheless to follow the data where it leads. Whereas the atheists, I don't think they have to be closed-minded in that regard. And that's why they hold this so dear and they fight so vehemently. It has to be true, because anything outside that presents a serious challenge to them. Whereas us, we can be a little more open to the data wherever it leads.
I think we need to keep in mind the sociology of science is a complex thing. And we're dealing with different modes of thinking within the scientific community. You can do an awful lot of science without invoking any questions about God or philosophy or materialism and so on. It doesn't enter into it. You're just analyzing what nature seems to be saying. And this is where science is, I think, its strongest and its best. But there are certain areas of science where this is not possible, and which are very interesting. And we all love to indulge into these areas. And that is questions of the past that we cannot test, whether it be cosmology or evolution and so on, is involved in it. I think perhaps one of the more striking examples of the complexities of the sociology of science is the fact that, according to a survey taken by Larson a few years ago of 1,000 scientists, he found that 40% of them believed in a God that answers prayer, 45% did not, 15% did not know. An awful lot of scientists believe in God. When you look at that figure, for instance, 40, 45, 15, so on, and you look at the scientific literature dealing with cosmology, origins, evolution, you get a totally different picture of what is being published compared to what the scientific community reflects in terms of its basic philosophy of materialism versus theism. And it is because of a pressure, a certain pressure, I think, that for materialism, which to a certain extent you can justify, because materialism is a little more easier easy to demonstrate and to prove than non-materialism per se. So I don't, I can understand why a community would go into that. I don't understand why they go into that at the sacrifice of excluding other possibilities. So there's a strong sociological factor in science that you must be materialistic, or you're not going to get published. A lot of the publications of these early, like Kepler, where he talks a lot about God and so on. Newton talked about God and so on in his publication. These would never get into scientific literature now, because we have a different social phenomena.
To be precise, they didn't get into the scientific literature then. They were published in book form, pretty much. There weren't journals that had peer review.
But they were accepted.
They were accepted. And I think that's one of the things that some people who are intelligent design advocates and creationists have learned, is that for some of this you have to do your own publication. Now, of course, that always runs the risk of, well, but it's not in the peer-reviewed literature. I don't know. Robert Gentry got a lot of stuff in the peer-reviewed literature. It'd be interesting to look at the methods that he did and see if that's a method that can be generalized. Because, for example, geologic reports of let's say, soft sediment deformation between two layers that are supposed to be millions of years apart.
At that time, which is about 40 years ago and so on, the scientific community was not as sensitive to creation and the creation movement, and they weren't aware of it or as leery of it.
In other words, he was lucky to be early.
But right now it's more difficult because there's more polarization.
Well, it might be worth trying it at least, and then documenting the results.
I'd like to make two comments. The first one is a response to Brian Bull because of his shock. I think that the way we teach science, K-12, contributes in both public and private school to the way that nurse views science. I think that's more a general view than an exception, because we teach that scientists do this research, and at the end they find out this, and the impression is given that the scientists they set up their process so that the end result is going to get the answer that they are looking for. I have a colleague who has a PhD in chemistry, and when he did his study for his dissertation, what he found out at the end was completely different, and so his dissertation was that didn't work. And a number of people who heard him describe that were just shocked. You mean you have a dissertation that at the end you didn't know anything? And so I think that that's more common than we might think. And as I taught my doctoral students, when they went to set up their research, often their expectation was what they were going to find out at the end, and we had to tell them, back off. You can't say in your proposal, I know what I'm going to find out, because you haven't collected anything yet. And the second point I'd like to make is that in the presentation about the man, Bill Nye, was that his name?
Yes.
I think the underlying point that he was trying to make was that we need to be in more control of the minds of children in education than we are today. He wants us to decide ahead of time that they will come out on the other end thinking this certain way. And I see that a lot in higher education as well. We say that students come in and we teach them how to think, and yet all we do is teach them what to think. And we don't teach them how to be critical thinkers very well. We don't do a good job of that in K graduate school. Often we say we do, but we don't.
And that goes for both public and private education.
Absolutely.
One of the interesting things to think about is that I did soften it a bit because Bill Nye said he isn't really interested in intruding into your homes and saying you can't talk about creationism in your homes, but he is interested in getting hold of controlled public school education.
And the minds of the students.
Here's the other thing. I think that, unless I miss my guess badly, he views private education as something that should shrivel up and die, in which case public school education is the whole of education. And so, although he doesn't want control over what you say at home, he does want control over what the kids teach in school, period. And I think that's being fair to him. I think if you were to ask him, I think he'd say, nah, private school or homeschool education is not the same quality, and really, all kids should be in public school. It would be interesting to be able to ask him that question specifically, but I suspect that would be his answer.
As a young man, I bought a set of Encyclopedia Britannica with the option of buying an update volume every year. I did that to keep current. I'm in awe of science, just jaw-dropping awe of the things science does. But I'm also aware that regularly they say, what we have just found changes everything that we ever believed. I applaud that attitude, but it says we don't have the last answer yet.
It says that last year's issue was somewhat defective.
Keep reading.
All this reminds me of a statement Samuel Clemens made a long time ago. It says, there are three kinds of lies. Probably heard that. Mark Twain says, there are three kinds of lies: lie, damn lie, and statistics. You could almost prove anything you want to with whatever your heart is set. But having said that, in fact, studying drugs, recently there was a study that came out that it really, truly does not help in the long run. But this study would never see the light of the day because there's billions of dollars involved all over the world in these miracle drugs. But anyways, I believe that when they say that there is global warming, I think, and if you, Al Gore and others, if they can make people believe that and it becomes a law, then they control our pocketbooks, you see. And when they say, well, evolution is the way to go, they're controlling the minds. Takes us to Revelation chapter 13. That day is coming. The momentum is perhaps growing. So it makes us to think about what we heard this morning in the worship.
In the Wall Street Journal, there's an article about Alzheimer's disease and how a group of scientists have been sidelined for 10 or 15 years. Those that support the fact that the tau protein is crucial because the beta amyloid advocates have won the day and gotten all the drug support and everything else. None of the medications, however, that they have produced have had any effect on Alzheimer's. And so the pendulum is swinging back again. And this is characteristic of science. It is certainly true that a certain group of scientists may be sidelined. In fact, the article goes back and refers to Helicobacter. Two Australians, one of whom was a pathologist, I might add. Two Australians advocated that Helicobacter...
Well, but pathologists don't know anything about real medicine.
They advocated that Helicobacter was a bacterium. It grew in the stomach. It was a real entity, and it was a major cause of stomach ulcers. They fought that battle, and it was a lonely one for 19 years. Eventually, science came around to their viewpoint, and they got the Nobel Prize, and now nobody questions it. It is definitely true that science will have, as Dr. Roth has mentioned, there is a sociology, but I don't believe that these swings are caused by any they're the result of enthusiasm. There's a group that's enthusiastic about Alzheimer's being caused by beta amyloid. There's another group that's enthusiastic about it being caused by the tau protein. One group gets funding for a while, but they haven't come up with anything that works. And so now the other group's going to get funding. And if they don't come up with something that works, we'll have a third group come up. That's the nature of science. What I was saying is that I think we do science an injustice when we infer that they are manipulating their data because they are evolutionists. And that, I think, I've never seen it. Now, maybe it does happen. But
well, it did happen once at least, Piltdown Man. But I agree with you. In general, that's not true.
Well, that was, yeah, and but that was very quickly uncovered by other scientists who were also
it took about 20
evolutionists.
years, but yeah.
But they were
my dad grew up in the era when it was supposed to be true.
But the ones that uncovered it were also evolutionists.
That's true.
They were not creationists, and that's what I'm saying. Yes, it does occasionally occur. I read about it in the literature. I've never personally experienced it, and I've worked on joint research projects with scores of scientists in this country and elsewhere in the world. So if it occurs, it's pretty rare, and I don't think that we do justice to science generally if we infer that it's very common and people will fudge their data because they're evolutionists and they don't want to come out with this or that finding. There are too many young graduate students who are just waiting to jump on a paper of that sort.
Yeah, well, I agree with you mostly. I think there are some subtle effects, and I'll just mention something that's coming out right now that would be very interesting to keep our eyes on, and that is looking at DNA from frozen material in the Canadian Eocene. The material, of course, by standard theories, should have sat there for 36 million years or something like that, cooking and doing whatever material does. It sits there either on the surface or slightly buried. So by that measure, you would expect to have no DNA whatsoever. Of course, from a short-age creationist perspective, you're looking at stuff that was living at the time of the flood, buried, perhaps living slightly after the flood, depending on whose theories you're using, buried, perhaps, maybe 100 years later, the Ice Age hits. Depending on whose model, some people say the Ice Age hit right away, but in any case, for a relatively short period of time, sitting on the surface, becoming deep frozen, now just coming out to be exposed as permafrost starts to show a little bit. This stuff could very easily have DNA that's still sequenceable. You'd have to do some special techniques on it because you're dealing with stuff that effectively is perhaps 200 standard years old, but it's still a worthwhile project. And my understanding is that's actually going on right now at Southern Adventist University. Lee Spencer being the most responsible for it. That's not a project that I would expect to see anybody even do in the standard literature, because they would instantly go, no, you can't do that.
I would. I mean, I know a whole bunch of graduate students who would just love to get their hands on stuff.
Well, let's ask it this way. Have you heard of anybody that's talked about it? No. You have to have the idea occur to you before you say, hey, that's an interesting idea. So I'm presenting it to you the first time. Get in contact with Lee, see what he's doing. I think it'd be fascinating. Maybe you can do a report sometime. Oh, that's right. But she was, that was an accident that happened. I mean, people could have looked for that a long time before. They didn't. She puts it this way: I was too ignorant to know that it couldn't happen.
She also advocates long ages as she publishes.
Oh, I know, and that kind of gives rise to people disputing her results for that very reason. You can't do that. It must be something else. It can't be, because those structures simply cannot last that long.
There's another complicating factor we might consider here, and this is a two-edged sword. It applies to creationists, it applies to evolution,
oh, yes,
and so on. No, what I'm going to mention here is the statement, that is made sometimes. Be careful, young man. You may find what you're looking for. There's so much that we don't know. There's so much to be found out that you have kind of an open field there to a certain extent as to where you go to look for your data. And we need to be careful about that.
It's easy to get confirming evidence if you're confident that it should be there.
While I agree with Dr. Bull that we have to be careful about writing off people's data because they have a different view than we have, on the other side of the coin, every time I look at somebody's surgical technique, you always are looking to see whether it only works in the hands of the surgeon, and you always evaluate data relative to what is it their gain or loss. The global warming, well, if they're hired by the oil companies, maybe they have one view. If they have to have grant money that's dependent on there being a global warming, they may have another slant to their view. So part of your scientific education is to evaluate that critically. And I think that is important to do, and failure to do that by either writing them off because they're a different worldview and is wrong, and failing to be critical because they have the same worldview is wrong.
And I want to make a point on that the bias may be even more subtle, and that is that people who feel strongly to begin with about global warming may gravitate towards institutions where they feel supported. And people who are skeptical of global warming may gravitate to institutions where they are supported as well. So you can have this happen without people having to impugn their own intellectual honesty. They simply, hey, you're going to give me money to do what I want to do anyway? I'll take it. So I think that the resort to dishonesty, it can be made too easily on both sides of that question. We have a comment over here.
Two things. The first one is I always tell my students follow the money. Who's funding it? And I think it's wonderful all the research that's been on nuts, but the very first one that was done was funded by Planters Peanuts, which in my mind does not necessarily impugn the researcher, but it raises a red flag to say, if Planters Peanuts is funding research on nuts, are we sure the data is correct? And the second thing is research that's done by social scientists comes, I think, there's more danger for them being influenced by their worldview than it might be a chemist. Because if I say to a group of students, was the person you saw, was their cap red or was it green, fails to ask the question, were they wearing a hat? Well, I may be studying hats, and so I assume everybody has a hat on, and that's a simplistic question. But the point is, if you're doing social science or research in education, for example, the way you frame the question defines the answer. And you have to be extremely careful in that kind of research that you're not skewing the data by the questions you ask and the way you frame the question.
When they're doing polling nowadays to find out who's going to be elected, they have to, you'll see them, and they'll say, half the time we put this one on top, half of the time we put the other one on top, just to get rid of those kinds of biasing things where people look at the first one and say, yeah, that's right.
But they don't always.
Well, they try
Self-correct.
very, especially in people like Poles who know that the real pole is coming, and if they're off by too much, people are going to say, hey, wait a minute, you guys have been cheating. So I think there is, and that's the advantage of having, by the way, reproducibility is if you don't like the Planters Peanuts study, you can do your own.
Well, and it has been done, so that's kind of an unfair thing, but.
Yeah.
The next study was funded by the American Walnut Society or Walnut Growers Association. I kid you not. The money for the beneficial effects of walnuts on cardiovascular disease was funded by the Walnut Growers Association.
I'm not surprised. Who else would fund it? The government hasn't figured out that this might be helpful.
In fact, in Today magazine, it says LU researchers to study walnuts and healthy aging. I don't know who's funding it, but what do you suppose is the pressure on the Adventist Health Study then? We all pretty much know what they're going to find, right? Supposing they don't, what are we going to do then?
Well, you know, that's why for me it's fascinating. I think that people are approaching the cheese question because they're afraid. Some people are afraid they're going to find one thing, and some people are afraid they're going to find another thing. And I think the proper thing to do is to dive right in and see what you get.
I couldn't agree more.
On the Campbell study, the China study, the people who use the same data and come up with different results are maligned heavily because they're not coming up with what they're supposed to come up with. And there are people who say that what the China study found is not using all of their own data. They're not looking at the whole picture. Well, maybe they're right, but maybe they're wrong.
Well, see, and this is where it comes down to eventually you have to decide whether you're going to be honest with the data or you're going to knuckle in and pressure, because in certain areas there is a lot of pressure, and if you get data that disagrees with everybody else, well, they just say, well, your laboratory doesn't know what it's doing. You almost need to have a few other people to support you. Otherwise, there's this tendency for the majority to kind of swamp the minority, even though the minority may have a very valid point.
A few years ago, I had a serious rash. They did a biopsy. The biopsy came back over the signature of one Brian Bull, but I assumed it could have been a graduate student or some lesser personage. It said I had bullous pemphigoid. I liked the sound of that. It's prestigious. So I got online to see what all the ramifications were, and it didn't seem to me like it was bullous pemphigoid. So I went back and said, I don't think that was right. So they did a second biopsy. Came back over the signature of Brian Bull, and it said the second biopsy didn't support the first biopsy. So for paying for two biopsies, I learned I didn't have bullous pemphigoid. I didn't follow that procedure any further because I didn't have enough money to do all the diseases available. But what it proves is even science is variable.
I think if you go back and look, you'll find that those slides would have been read by the dermatologist who did the biopsy. They're not read in our laboratory. No, it doesn't matter.
I've still got the rash.
Are you sure you don't have bullous pemphigoid?
Well, I mean, that's always a problem. I'm sure that we've all done things where what we thought was correct turned out not to be, or sometimes we questioned our first diagnosis when it shouldn't have been because it wasn't quite typical. So none of this is going to be absolutely 100%, and that's one of the things that I think that we need to be careful about. I don't think science is going to finally answer this problem once and for all and with complete security.
I guess my only point was I hope we can carry on this discussion and raise our kids to be creationists without besmirching the character and the scientific integrity of every scientist who is an evolutionist, because I have not found the ones that I know to shade their data as a result of that. And I know a lot of scientists who actually have changed their minds about things that might in fact influence the age of the Earth or genetics or geology. We have a very poignant example in Adventism. We have a young man who was the first scientist hired by the Geoscience Research Institute who undertook to develop a method to prove that carbon-14 was incorrect. That method essentially confirmed carbon-14, or at least it gave results that didn't disconfirm it, but were interpretable along those same lines. He basically was...
I think that your latter description is correct.
Yeah, and he was requested to go and find work somewhere else, which he did, and he became famous as a result of having developed this method. I sat with him when his first data set came through, and we looked at that and we tried to figure out any way possible to reinterpret it, and we couldn't. There's now a whole field that developed off of that particular research project, but I know he started out to prove the validity of carbon-14. And I mean the disvalidity. The invalidity of carbon-14. Yeah. And how do I know that? Well, he told me he was not going to actually assay anything that was datable beyond the 6,000 years or 5,000 years in his thesis defense, because he didn't want to contaminate his thesis defense with this. And it was not until after he had gotten his PhD from Caltech that he started looking at things that probably were going to be dating older than that. But he spent the rest of his life actually shunned by a fair segment of the congregation with whom he worshiped because of these findings. That's what I call integrity.
There are a couple of comments I think that can be made. One is I think that we need to be very careful about saying that people are dishonest. I think that has to be an absolute last resort, and basically requires catching them in the act, not that their data or their belief system even disagrees with ours. And I think that's true not just for Adventists but for non-Adventists. I think we need to be just as careful about people who are atheists. I don't think Bill Nye is being dishonest with the information he has. That I think that's a very valid point. The other thing that's interesting is that in this particular case, there's an article written by Robert Brown, suggesting that the, which is also in the literature as well, that the Rasmussization constants changed with time, and that if you didn't make them change with time, you actually come out with a relatively short chronology. I talked with this person, and unfortunately, he charged Robert Brown with selected and erroneous data. So I do know that the charges can go both ways, and I think that both sides need to be very careful about impugning the motives of other people.
That was my point.
I think in the case of that article, it's you need to keep in mind there's an awful lot of data in that article. It's talking about over 100 samples, at least in the several samples.
You're talking about the Brown article?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Actually, my question to him was, well, which ones? And he said, well, what are you going to do with them? Well, I'm going to look them up and find out what they really are. And he couldn't come up with any answers in terms of which.
This article that Bob Brown put forth, is rather strong support for recent creation and challenges seriously. The older dates, because unless you change those racialization constants by 1,000 times, and this is serious change, folks. Change a constant by 1,000 times. A constant is supposed to be constant. You cannot explain the trend in that data.
Well, it was, I think, interesting. Video sparked a little comment. Next week we'll talk about theistic evolution. And those of you who have the book are invited to read the chapter and come prepared to discuss.